I get to start off the day with a topic that is simultaneously boring and terrifying. I can't think of another example of something that fits that description, but grant writing certainly does. And I'm going to try to make this as interesting as I can, pepper it with some examples from my own career. I either have or have held funding at the K, R, and U level in the principal investigator role. I have done this. I have sat in that chair. I have struggled to get grant funding, and I'll share some of my insights and some of the insights of my colleagues that have been successful in the grant funding world. We're going to start by talking about what a grant is and how it becomes funded, because I think it's important to understand that before you can actually put pencil to paper or hands to keyboard to begin writing. It's essential to understand that review process. Then we're going to try to talk about the components required for NIH grant submission so that you develop a good strategy for writing those, and then I'll try to tell you where not to step. Because there are definitely some pitfalls in the construction of grants that if you avoid them will improve your likelihood of funding. Now, this is not a grant writing course. Right? You can take multi-day grant writing courses. In an hour, I can't teach you how to write the perfect grant. I can, however, give you some good approaches. Now, there are many ways to approach a grant submission, many ways to organize your thoughts. I'll give you mine, and I'll give you some thoughts that I have culled from other experts over time. But if you are in a training capacity, and that includes junior faculty, please do use your mentor's insights. He or she is, by definition, successful in their field, or they wouldn't be your mentor. They know the ropes. They know how to write for the particular audience that funds their and your kind of work. And do be aware that both single and multi-day grant writing courses and workshops exist. They exist here on this campus. They exist outside this campus. Investigate them. Take a day or two and dig deeper into how to construct a successful grant. Now, we're going to talk for the first few minutes about different kinds of funding mechanisms, because I suspect there are people in the room that are in varying stages of their career, probably skewed towards the early side. But I want to make sure we're starting from the same foundation in terms of our understanding of definitions. So the NIH offers investigator-initiated research funding mechanisms, or unsolicited proposals, or specific institute-initiated research, or solicited proposals. So the vast majority of grant submissions that NIH receives, and just for the record, we're going to focus on NIH-style submissions today. Please understand that the NIH is not the only funding mechanism that writes big checks for original research. There are foundation awards that are quite substantial. There are other governmental awards, including the Department of Defense, AHRQ, CDC, FDA, that write big checks for high-quality research. I'd still believe that the NIH is the flagship biomedical funding agency in the United States, and if you can do this, you can do the others. So we're going to focus on this. The most common kind of NIH application that's submitted is, in fact, your idea that comes out of your head that's not responding to a specific request from an institute. So here you would use what's called a parent announcement, a general funding announcement that says, hey, send us your good ideas. All right? This might be in a training grant context, like a K08 or a K23. We're going to go through the alphabet soup here in a little bit. Or a prime award, an RL1 type research grant. All right? But there will be a general, generic announcement to which you can respond. Now, an institute at the NIH can also identify areas of science that are high priorities for them. And they come up with these topics either through internal discussions or through strategic planning sessions where they invite experts from around the country or the world to weigh in on where a given institute should focus their efforts and spend their money. And you might hear about an RFA, or a request for applications. This is an important announcement that you should pay attention to, because an RFA has money attached to it. So here, an institute has identified an area of focus and said, we are going to set aside X million dollars to fund 5 grants or 7 grants or 3 grants in this area. And they will use a special one-time only review group dedicated to that specific request for applications. A program announcement is another flavor of these institute-initiated submissions. So here, the institute again identifies an area of science that they would like to have in their portfolio. We believe that it's in our mission at this institute to study X. And here are some examples of how one might study X. But we're not setting aside any money for it. You're going to have to compete with everybody else for the general pot of money. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It gives you some guidance, and it allows you to say, oh, this institute is particularly interested in this area of science. Turns out science often spans institutes. And this might provide you with some guidance to say, oh, this project on sepsis could be funded by the Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, or it could be funded by General Medical Sciences. Which one should I go to? If there's a program announcement that sounds an awful lot like your hypothesis, then maybe you go to that institute. Now, where do you find these things? Well, NIH.gov is a great place to look, and you can use the search feature and use keywords that match your area of science and see if there is a funding announcement that matches it. You can also sign up for email alerts from institutes, where in your email box will land at a regular interval new program announcements or RFAs that come out from a given institute. And when you search, you get something like this that gives you a listing of what the grant is, its grant number. This happens to be a program announcement. And it tells you when it's active and what dates you should think about in terms of your submission planning. And it tells you what they want. So you can read through it and decide if your science matches this, or if you can tailor your science to match this. So once you have a research idea and you develop it and you vet it locally, then you can actually interact with the NIH to get some feedback about whether your idea is indeed appropriate for a funding announcement or even appropriate for a given institute. There are program officers or program officials there whose names are listed on the NIH website, and you can call them, email them, talk to them. I always prefer talking because how many emails do you get in a day, right? I get a lot fewer phone calls than I do emails, and I remember them more. You can have a richer conversation with your program officer on the phone. And they can hear your idea. Maybe you send them your specific aims page or a paragraph outlining what you'd like to do, and they can say, ooh, that's perfect for this funding announcement that we have, or even better, one that we're thinking about having or is going to be announced in the near future. Or they might say, you know what, this might be better for a different institute. We're not really interested in that topic. And you can save yourself some time and a headache by avoiding a submission to the wrong institute. So they really are specialists in that institute, and they're invaluable. They can be helpful in advising about both K-series and R-series grants. So what are these letters, Ks, Rs, Fs, Us? Well, so the NIH has its own language about how grants should be identified, and the F series are those who are in formal training programs, either predoctoral or postdoctoral fellowship programs. The K series, these represent mentored training grants that are most frequently associated with junior faculty. So these are folks that are either about to finish or have finished their fellowship and are joining faculty somewhere and will be learning how to do research under the auspices of a mentor. Now, the K08 and K23 family of grants is becoming a little bit anachronistic given that translational research is so prevalent and is such an important part of our scientific mission. But they're still divided into K08 being basic and K23 being clinical. It's important to understand that if you have an early translational project where you're beginning to test hypotheses in human samples from patients, that still is probably a K08. My K08 back in the day was exclusively doing mechanistic work on samples from critically ill children. Now, similarly, if you have a late translational project in which you are moving more towards the interventional side, more towards the bedside, that may well be appropriate for a K23, even if it doesn't involve, let's say, an intervention in humans. Our series grants are reserved typically for independent investigators. These are people, many of whom have graduated, if you will, through the K process, and they do not require the presence of a senior mentor to help either fund or execute the science. So again, these are reserved for people who are independent investigators. The RO3, R21 family tend to be of small budget and short duration. RO1s are the workhorse grants of the NIH, which are big original science grants. U awards and P awards are large multi-investigator or multi-center studies or projects that tend to have a very big price tag and tend to be competed for by folks who are relatively senior in their careers. So let's talk about Ks. So these are a fantastic career step. They allow you to mature into an independent scientist. They allow you to learn from your mentor, and it buys your time. This is where most of the money in a K award goes. So in order to receive a K award, you have to have typically 75% or more of your effort devoted to research. And there are funds in the grant to pay your time to liberate you from the clinical environment. An exception to this could be our surgical colleagues. I don't know if there's any surgeons in the room, but because our surgical colleagues tend to need to maintain clinical skills and caseloads, it's not uncommon for K awards to be funded at a 50% level for surgeons. But for medical subspecialties, typically 75%. They go up to 5 years, and they require a mentor. So for those people who are clinician scientists in the room, you spend a lot of time during medical school, residency, fellowship, learning how to take care of patients, and not so much time during that large period learning how to do science. So most people come into science relatively late during that time frame, often during fellowship. So they still have a pretty steep learning curve on up through junior faculty time, and it's okay, it's fine, it's normal to be dependent on a mentor well into your junior faculty time. Now, these K awards protect that time. They protect space that might be allocated in a startup package to develop those research skills and ideas, to learn from your mentor. These projects should be of a more limited scope than, say, an RO1, because number one, you're learning, and number two, you are hopefully acquiring new skills that you didn't already have in fellowship. It's very unlikely that someone's going to fund a K award for you to do the exact same kind of science that you did during fellowship or some other research period in your life, because it's all about getting new tools for the toolbox, and you need to spend time learning those new tools. This helps you develop a track record of NIH funding, and you must have that experienced mentor who is a funded researcher, who's a well-published researcher, ideally one who has mentored others. You need to have a commitment of institutional resources, not only your protected time, but space, equipment, personnel, and so forth, because the budget tends to be kind of small for that stuff. So a K award typically does not completely offset the cost of your science. Your mentor's budget will help offset that. A startup package or other institutional support will help offset that. And you must have a training plan. We're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about how to write Ks. Now, what are these Rs that I'm talking about? Well, yes, sir. You may. Yeah, so K99s /R00s are a transition to independence grant, where you typically have 2 years of funding at the K level, and then the budget goes up and you have 3 years of funding at the R00 level. I think that's an outstanding example of a transition grant that will allow a person to move from the K to the R within one project. It allows you to do more. I think the budget is high enough that it allows you to do more impactful science, particularly in the last few years of the project. I personally don't have any experience with that award. I don't know any clinician scientists who have received that award. And under what context have you had folks be successful in that submission?
Terrific opportunity for.
Excellent point.
I think it's important for this.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's another family of, well, not really family, but there's another type of award in this way that's a transition back into science. And forgive me, I don't have the number on the top of my head, but it's easily searchable. There are training grant equivalents for mid-career faculty who would like to get back into the research world, having left the research world to be more clinically focused. And these provide re-entry, they're called re-entry grants. And these also exist. If you search re-entry grants in the NIH library, you will find these opportunities as well. They are similarly high-value targets for specific people who meet that description. Now, in terms of R-series grants, R03s and R01s are shorter term, they're 2-year grants with a relatively small budget. So R03s are very small grants, $50,000 a year, not renewable. R21s, the budget's a little bit bigger. That $275 is divided over 2 years, so it's less than that per year, of course. And these are not renewable. These tend to be variable from institute to institute. There are some institutes that don't offer R21s anymore. Some view them as not so great returns on investment from the institute's perspective. But they can be fantastic grants for those who are trying to develop an idea, trying to develop pilot data, say to justify a larger submission or to justify, say, a large multi-center clinical trial. You might want to do a smaller version of it for a couple years first. R01s, again, these research project grants are the workhorses of the NIH, 4 to 5 years. The budget varies, and you always need to look at the funding announcement to understand what the budget is specifically. They are renewable. That's a competitive renewal process, but you can renew and resubmit. There are investigators who have held the same R01 for 20 years, having renewed it time after time after time. Those investigators have been very successful. U.S. citizenship is not required for these, but some degree of independence is, right? That's the whole point of moving through the K series to the R series, where now you are an independent investigator. It's really important for you to understand that this is a patient person's game, right? So the NIH accepts applications 3 times a year, right? For first submissions, February, June, and October. They will review them in June, they will decide to fund them in September, and they will, the earliest the check is written, if the budget is passed in Congress, would be December. So we're talking about getting on to a year before you get your money from when you submit the grant, and that's provided it gets funded on the first submission, which often doesn't happen. So get used to waiting. This is a normal thing, but plan for it. Now, the grant goes through many different hands before it gets to the institute that will actually fund it. And we're going to talk for a couple of minutes about study section. And it's important for you to get this because it helps enforce how necessary it is for you to write this grant superbly, right? So, the study section is made up of, let's say, 20 volunteers. This is important. They get paid a nominal amount to do this, but they're essentially volunteers. These people are successful. They're established scientists with expertise in your general area, hopefully. But because they're successful scientists, they're busy. And they're trying to review, let's say, 5 to 10 grants out of many that have been submitted to that study section. And they're doing it at home. They're doing it on the plane. They're doing it on the train. They're putting the kids to bed, and they're getting this pile of grants out to read it. They're tired. They're cranky. By definition, they're in a bad mood when they pick up your grant. Okay? So your job is to not make that worse. And so these volunteers, 2 or 3 of them, are going to be assigned your grant to read. And there'll be 1 primary reviewer and 1 or 2 secondary and tertiary reviewers. And they will read your grant in detail, every bit of it, and they'll provide a preliminary score along with written comments. And about half of the grants that this group of reviewers reviews will not be discussed because they don't have time at their meeting to talk about all these grants. So they're going to generally lop off the bottom half and not discuss them. And if that happens to yours, you'll get a written critique back and without a score, and it will say not discussed. That used to be referred to as being triaged. And grants that are triaged rarely go on to get funded. You can revise and resubmit them, but it better be a pretty big teardown. Because if it wasn't meritorious enough to be discussed, it's going to be hard to bring it up to the level of funding without a lot of work. Now, that study section will meet often in person, sometimes now in 2015 by phone or teleconference, and over a few days review lots and lots of grants. Those handful, 2, 3 people who have actually read your grant will get up and talk about it in detail and provide oral critiques, and they'll share their scores. Everybody else around that table has access to your grant, but they've probably just read your specific aims page. They definitely haven't read your whole grant. Right? So those couple of 3 people are going to decide what everybody else in that room thinks about your grant, unless there's 1 or 2 people in the room who has a lot of passion about your science, either for or against, and they may voice that passion in the group. But these really 2 or 3 people are going to hugely influence what the other people around the room think about your grant and how they score it, how they vote. So you're really having a small number of opportunities to sell your science. And that's what a grant is. It's you selling your science. You have to communicate passion, enthusiasm, and do so very clearly for this reader who is reading your grant at 11 o'clock at night when they're tired and cranky. Right? So keep that in mind. Now, how do you then start writing? Well, turns out you have an instruction book. You have a guide. There's a sweet 263-page set of application instructions. Right? So I hate to tell you, but you got to read them. You got to read the instructions. A really, really quick and easy way to make that cranky reviewer more cranky is if you don't follow the instructions. Right? They know the instructions because they've read a whole bunch of grants. So read them and follow them. Grants are written in a different way than any other kind of thing that you have written before. It's a very unique style of communicating. I mean, my English teacher in high school would have a stroke if she saw what I was writing for a grant. It's dense. It's not in any way flowery. It's not in any way redundant or repetitive. Faulkner would hate this, right? But you're not writing that way. You're looking to write like a journalist. Clear, concise, unambiguous. And you write it in a certain font. You write it in a certain text size. It's true that your figure and table legends can be smaller in font, but please be reasonable because people who read grants are doing so at 11 o'clock at night and they have bad eyesight and it's hard to read 6-point font in your figure legend. They might miss it. One nice thing the NIH does is they give you half-inch margins, so you can fit more on a page, right? And you'll find that you need that space. So when I get a grant to review and it has 1-inch margins, I know that they didn't read the instructions. They don't have that much to say because they're not struggling for space. Right? So read those instructions, use those half-inch margins. It's a lot of dense text in grants. So you need to find creative ways to make important points stand out to the reader. So use italics, use bold font, use bullet points to highlight key text. That text must be black, but the figures can have color in them, and that's okay. Those grants are uploaded to the reviewers, or they download them in PDF form, and you can see color on those. But sometimes people print grants out on paper, and they put them in their bags, and they take them on the airplane with them, all right? And if your beautiful color figure looks like nothing when printed out in black and white, and you can't tell the difference between the stuff that looks so vivid in color, you've made a bad choice in your colors. Right? So I would ideally print your grant out in black and white and make sure that the things in your figures that were impactful remain impactful when viewed in black and white. Know your page limits, so your application will have them. And you can see they vary. Your specific aims will always be one page. Your research strategy may vary depending on the mechanism of grant to which that you're using for the application. Believe it or not, 12 pages ain't much when you have to tell a really big story. And you have to start from the beginning of that story. But you must be respectful of that. So your grants end up looking something like this, really dense. And you've got those half-inch margins that are allowing you space to tell your story, but there is a lot of information you need to convey. And so things that I like to do when I write grants is I like to use one visual thing, a figure or table per page during the research strategy section, at least up until the methods, which can be less image heavy, so that it's a little easier on the eyes and the reviewer has something to look at other than a big giant block of text. I use bullet points to convey important concepts and make sure that the reader gets them. I will avoid redundancy. Saying the same thing 8 times in a grant tells me that either you don't have that much to say or you're wasting my time by reading the same thing 8 times. So try to avoid redundancy, but at the end of a section, you can tell me what you think is most important that I should carry away from this section. So again, if the aims of this are achieved, the field will be advanced by these 4 things, just in case you weren't paying attention during the last page. Again, avoid flowery language. Be very clear. Now, people who are on study section, like I say, they're smart people. And they're on study section because they are smart in an area of thematic research. Your application was assigned to that study section because its content fits that field of research. But there's no guarantee that anybody on that study section is going to be an expert in your particular piece of that science. Right? I would assume that the person who's reading your grant doesn't know anything about it. Right? Don't assume that they understand your methods. Don't assume that they are familiar with the literature surrounding your work, because odds are they might have heard of it, odds are they might be aware of it, but they may not be an expert. Lastly here, if something is confusing, it is your fault. I'm going to say that again. If it's not clear, it's your fault as the writer. Right? It's very, very frustrating to get that review back and to say, oh, this person missed it completely. They didn't get it at all. And you're angry at the reviewer. In reality, the person you should be angry with is yourself, because it should be impossible to misinterpret your point, or to misinterpret your data if you have written the grant clearly and sold it clearly. This is where your friends come into play. Right? So have your colleagues review your work, not the day before it's due, but well before it's due, so they can read it and say, I don't understand this. I don't understand why you're saying this. If they don't get it, the reviewer's not going to get it. And pick people who aren't experts in your field. Pick people who haven't seen your grant 18 times, because you start getting blinders after a while and are unable to identify areas of confusion because you've seen it so many times. Pick smart people who don't know your science and have them read through your grant well ahead of time. Now, more about Ks. You need to convince the reviewers that you are worthy of funding, you as a person. So you write a section called Candidate's Background, describes your training and your experience and where you want your career to go. But you specifically have to describe how this grant and the funding it will provide will advance your career. What do you want to be at the end of this 5-year training grant? What new tools are you going to have in your toolbox? From whom are you going to learn them, and why are they the appropriate people to teach you? How are you going to pick up those skills? Are you going to spend time in a laboratory? Are you going to take classes? Are you going to go to seminars? How are you going to learn this? Over what period of time are you going to do it? I said classwork. This is actually a really good idea. I think most successful Ks involve classwork. And a red flag is the word audit. Right? I'm going to audit this class in the College of Public Health. Well, when I hear someone say I'm going to audit a class, I hear, I might go, I might not go, whatever. Right? So you take it for credit. You don't necessarily take it in the pursuit of a degree, though you could fold a degree into a K award. But at the very least, you're going to say, I'm taking it for credit, I'm going to show up, I'm going to get a good grade. A figure, a graphic description of your timeline with the end point being independence is a great idea. Something like this, where this happens to be a 3-year grant, but you say, I'm going to take these classes here, I'm going to learn these skills here, and my science is going to overlap in this way. And here's the people that I'm going to learn from. Now, this is described in more detail in the text, but this figure gives the reviewer a sense of, oh, okay, that's how they're approaching it, and that is or is not feasible. Now, particularly if you're doing human subjects research, you need to include how you're going to get training in the responsible conduct of research. Now, in 2015, it's not enough just to do the online city courses. Right? It's not just about clicking answers on an online quiz, but in-person, responsible conduct of research training that is ongoing and iterative through the life of your grant will be a necessity. You will get dinged if you don't have that, if you're proposing human subjects research. You really have to answer this question. How are you going to become an independent investigator through the course of this work? And if you do that, you'll be good. Now, for any grant, whether it's a K award or an R award or any kind, the most crucial part of that grant is a specific aims page. It is the entire project on one page, and it's short. I mean, it's short. And you have to tell a really compelling story in a really small amount of space. And it's really important because it's the first thing that those 3 reviewers who are cranky are going to read. And it's the only thing that most members of the study section will read. So you have about a half a page to answer a few questions in the introduction or the preamble to your specific aims. And it's, why do I care about this? Why is it important? What gap in the literature or our knowledge does this work fill? What is your central hypothesis for your research program? Why you? Why should I fund you to do this work? If this work is successfully accomplished, how will the field be changed? And then there are the aims themselves. So 2 to 4 specific aims. I would reserve 4 specific aims for a more beefy submission like a big R01 or the U Award family of grants. 4 specific aims for a K would be rather ambitious. But good aims have some things in common. Number 1, they have to fit on one page. Right? So you quite literally are not allowed for this to drip over a couple of lines or a paragraph onto a second page. One page. The aims themselves, these describe the science that you're going to do, sets of experiments or sub-hypotheses to be tested within your central hypothesis. Now, these aims must be thematically related. Otherwise, your grant is diffuse and not going to be funded. But the aims must be distinct and not interdependent. This is a killer, right? So what do I mean by this? It means that if one aim fails, the hypothesis is blown out of the water, you can't even do the science when it comes down to it. If that happens and it kills the other two aims because they're dependent on success of that first aim, then the grant's dead. If people can see that, they'll say, well, I'm not going to risk this big chunk of money on specific aim 1 if specific aim 2 and 3 are completely dependent on it, and the whole thing goes away if aim 1 fails. I will tell you, this is amongst the hardest things to do, is to write 3 aims that are thematically related, highly relevant, feasible, and not interdependent. All right? So this is a huge test when you're thinking about ideas to put together as specific aims, to read them and say, okay, if this one fails, can I do this one? If this one fails, can I do these two? If the answer is no, scratch them out and start again. All right? Because that is the first thing that a reviewer, when they get to those aims, is going to look for, is interdependence. You also want them to be hypothesis-driven and not descriptive. So descriptive is a really, really mean, nasty thing to say about a grant or an aim. All right? If I come back and tell you that your aim is descriptive, it's like I've said something bad about your mother. I mean, it's really not nice. Right? So you want to use active language. We are going to identify. We are going to quantitate. We are going to determine. We're not going to describe. We're not going to evaluate. We're not going to investigate. Right? So even the verbs you use are very important in trying to convince the reviewer that you're taking an active, hypothesis-driven approach to your aims. They have to be feasible. I have to read this, and I have to say, okay. If I read this and say, there's no way they're doing this, they're not even, if they had 10 years, they couldn't do this, then I'm not going to fund the grant, even if the hypotheses are sound and the methodology is sound. So think about that feasibility piece. They have to be readable and not full of jargon that those reviewers won't understand. If you're planning to explain something on page 6 of the grant, and you say, as we will describe later, this really long, complicated thing will happen. People aren't going to get to later. Right? So you have to be clear and compelling there on page 1, and you have to be enthusiastic. People have to read this and want to fund this grant. You want to make them excited. You want to take this tired, cranky 11 o'clock at night reviewer and make them want to turn the page and read more. Right? This study will represent a paradigm shift in the management of pediatric trauma for the following really exciting reasons. Right? That's how you have to write it. This page takes a long, long, long time. It's the most important part of your grant, and it will potentially take months. It'll take months to get the aims so that they are clear, hypothesis-driven, not interdependent, yet thematic, feasible, to write about them in a clear and compelling way, to get this just exactly perfect. Right? Once you have this page, the rest of the grant doesn't exactly write itself, but it moves a lot faster. All right? You really have direction, and you know what you're writing about once you get this page perfect. So once you get past this page, you write your research strategy. This is the body of the grant. It'll be the longest section in terms of space. It'll start with a significance page, or why do I care about this? You'll expand upon that first preamble of your specific aims page. And you'll take a page or two and tell me why I care about this science. There is an innovation section that will become part of your score. And you need to tell me why this is new or different. It's usually a page or so, maybe less, depending on how innovative your project is. Now understand, some projects are not all that innovative. That's okay. Your overall score is a summation of multiple areas of your grant, not just your innovation. But if your grant does have an innovative aspect to it, you sure as heck should highlight it so I get it. Right? And then there's the approach. What are you going to do? What is your science? This is typically done in order, specific aim to specific aim. and you will walk through each one. You'll give an introduction to it. You will display preliminary data that you will hopefully have to support your aims. You'll walk through your methods, including your statistics. Do not avoid putting in a statistical section. Right? Every grant will have a need for a statistical section. Some of them more robust than others, depending on the scope of the project. But wow, if you give me a great set of ideas and no way of how to analyze them, I'm not going to fund your grant. All right? So you need to work with your statistician, if you have one. If you don't have one, you might want to get one, be a partner, right? And put together a beautiful analytic section. You also need to tell me what's going to happen if something goes wrong, because I haven't been a part of a project yet where something didn't go wrong. Right? So you need to tell me what are the anticipated problems and pitfalls and what your approach will be to those. If this happens, which it could, we're going to deal with it in this way. Because you might get a reviewer who knows about some of those pitfalls, and if you don't describe what you're going to do, they'll say, well, this person's naive, and they're not able to communicate to me how they're going to deal with this clearly anticipated problem. Right? So do that. And then, of course, future directions. What am I going to do next with this information, and how is it going to advance the field? If there are some general scientific methods that you're going to use, bench techniques, analytic techniques, and so forth that might be used in all of your aims, you could put those at the end after describing all of the aims, and you can say, see general research methods for our approach to flow cytometry throughout this submission, for example. Okay. Now, plan to think about your budget. Right? So direct and indirect costs. Let's talk about these for a minute or two. So direct costs are things that have to be paid to do the science. They are salaries and benefits for people like you, your staff, etc. Money for the science, the reagents, consumables, equipment, core costs. Money for subcontracts if you're doing multi-center work. Money to pay a statistician and other collaborators. Equipment if need be. Don't forget they want to make sure you're going to go to meetings and learn about the science and present your science, so a travel budget is typically included. And then there are so-called indirect costs. Now, if you're applying for an award and it says the limit for the budget is $250,000 direct costs, they're just talking about this stuff. Right? What will happen in addition to those costs is that your institution, in this case OSU or Nationwide Children's, will tack on a bit of money to pay for the building and the lights and the heating and other facilities and administration, F&A costs. All right? That extra money that's tacked on maybe as much as about half of your grant's budget. Right? In some centers, it's even higher than that. So just be aware that these indirect costs go to the institution, not you, not for science. This is the stuff that you budget for the science. Now, for our awards, if you have a lower ticket item, less than $250 a year, you can use a less detailed modular budget. For a bigger ticket item, they need to be much more detailed, these budgets. K awards are typically chintzy. Most of the K award budget goes to your salary. Right? Relatively little goes for science. So that's why you need to pair up with a mentor who has a pocketbook that can afford your science and or have institutional support that will pay for your science. Do that feasibility analysis. If you're doing a K award, that's mostly for you because the money's fixed. You get this much. For ours, you want to make sure that you have enough money for the project. If you plan to spend $10 million when I look at your budget and I say, the only way they can do this science is to spend $10 million and you're asking for $4 million, then I'm probably not going to fund this project. Or at least I'm going to cut your budget substantially so that it's within the limits of the award. There are experts, Sponsored Projects Office, Clinical Research Services, and others that can help you work and develop a budget and do a feasibility analysis. Now, there's a lot of little stuff that you got to sweat in this process, and don't leave this to the last day. because it takes a while to get these bits and pieces together. We're going to talk about a few of them. A biosketch. So everybody in this room probably has written a CV or a resume. A biosketch is like that, but it's an NIH-specific resume using a new format. And one of the first things you need to do is to go on my NCBI, which you can get to through PubMed, that website, and you have to create an account and log in. And you need to pull your bibliography into something called My Bibliography. How do you do that? Well, you go to PubMed, you find a paper of yours, and you pull down here and say, send to My Bibliography. You click to add to My Bibliography. And when you do that, it will go into this electronic format that has a URL. And if you click on this, it'll take you directly, or anyone can go directly to your bibliography. And on your biographical sketch, which goes on a form that you download from the NIH, and this is a specific form, you fill in your demographic data, and you write a personal statement. There is no one biosketch anymore. Right? You have to write a paragraph that indicates what your role will be on the submission that's proposed, and how enthusiastic you are about that role, and why this is really, really important. It's like a mini version of the preamble to your specific aims page, but it particularly highlights what your role on this project will be. Then it talks about you have to indicate your positions and honors. And then you are now, again, this is recently revised. Biosketches must be in this format beginning this year, right? You must highlight your contribution to science. It's no longer just putting a list of papers that you've written, right? You are able to identify 4 or 5 areas, max, that you have contributed to science. And you get a paragraph to describe this, and then you can list up to 4 manuscripts that you think highlight that area of contribution. Now, folks that are writing K awards tend to have a little bit of thin on their biosketch, right? So you may not have 4 areas of science you've contributed to. That's okay. Reviewers understand that. But think about things that you've done that have advanced the field or have the potential to advance the field and highlight them. You then include that link to your complete list of published works in My Bibliography. It's essential that you do that. So rather than, again, listing your publications, here you put your publications that highlight a specific strength, and then a link to the publication list in full, and then your list of ongoing and previous grant support. The page limit was increased from 4 to 5 with this revision, but again, folks that are starting out and are writing Ks often don't need 5 pages, and that's okay. Make sure things are correct. Read those instructions. For some K awards, you can put review articles and chapters. For R awards, generally that's frowned upon to include those as examples of your contribution to science. Putting abstracts, just abstracts, not things that have made it to manuscripts, or works in preparation are not good ideas. Right? Yes?
Can you touch just a little more on how, as a beginning investigator, you can obviously not inflate what you've done, as reviewers can see you do that, but sort of define your contributions to science with?
Yeah, it's a good question, and frankly, it's one to which I can provide a speculative answer, because this format of Biosketch hasn't been around but a few months, and I think it's only been through 1 cycle of review. So I don't know how reviewers are going to react to that. I will tell you, as a person who has reviewed Ks, I would respond favorably to you describing how your area of work could move science forward. And odds are you've published something, or else you wouldn't be submitting a K. If you're submitting a K and you have 0 publications, I probably wouldn't submit that K. Right? I would think about how I could get some publications. So then I have something on my CV to talk about. And I would talk about those publications. And the impact might be narrower in scope than a person who's far senior, but that's okay. You still need to convey enthusiasm about those publications that you've written about. And don't forget that for Ks, this is a mentor training award. if you're working in your mentor's lab or your mentor's research program, it'd be fine to say, we have advanced the field in this way. You might be piggybacking on your mentor's success and use some of their publications in there. For a K, that's fine, because I'm not just funding you, I'm funding you and your mentor to work together. So I think that would be a reasonable approach as well. Now, if everything on your biosketch is about your mentor, that's probably not a good idea. But I think you can use one of those contributions to science sections and say, this is how our lab or our research group has contributed to science. Make that very clear in the paragraph. And I think that would be a strength. Sir?
I just did a little reading about this in relationship to the Ks, and kind of what it said was if you are a young person, you probably want to have maybe one or two contributions to science, and maybe once you're a full professor, you can put four on there.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. So don't just make stuff up or put stuff in there that's fluff. It needs to be real. And as you say, I think most folks applying for Ks will have only one or two, and that's okay.
Yeah, so it kind of went through like junior, associate, and full professor, and like one or two for junior, associate professor 2 to 3, and full professor 4.
Yeah.
You have some examples on the NIH website too, and for like a postdoc going for like a K99 award, they literally break it into like graduate school, and then what you learned in graduate school, and then maybe what you've done in your postdoc and stuff like that. So they kind of break it out as far as your training in that way too. So that's a way to sort of separate what you've done.
There's actually 3 formats now too. There's a general, I think, fellowship, and then the loan repayment program has its own, which is weird. But
So read the instructions. Read them. Now, because I'm short on time here, I'm gonna try to move forward quickly. Do make sure you're submitting the right biosketch. All right? This personal statement must be unique. I have reviewed grants where people have sent a biosketch that they wrote for some other project, and the personal statement has nothing to do with the grant at hand. That goes in the negative column when reviewing that grant. Letters of support. You need them. Read those instructions and understand from whom you need them. You might need one from your chair or from certainly from your mentor. K awards have a specific mentor statement embedded within them. 2 pages max. I'm not going to read more than that. Some submissions include those letters in your page limitations, and you might have to sort of cut and paste and do some arts and crafts to squeeze a couple letters onto one piece of paper. People are really busy. Do not say, hey, can you write a letter for me, and then walk away. Don't do that. Right? The people that you want writing you letters are by default successful and really busy. Write the letter for them. Right? That way you know what it says. You know that it hits the points that you want to be hit. These are the bits of my training that are important. These are the reasons this study is really important, and so forth. Now, you might say, well, that sounds awfully narcissistic. How could I do that ethically? Well, you do it by saying, I have taken the liberty of creating a draft letter for you. Please review it and edit as you see fit. That way they can trash the whole thing and start again if they want to. What they're going to do is go, thank you so much. And they will read it, and they will make some changes, and they'll say, that's a little bit much, and they'll tone that down. And then they will finish it, and they'll edit it, and it'll be fine. Don't make them sound the same, though. If you use the exact same language in 8 letters of support, I know you wrote it. Okay? Facilities and equipment. Again, institutions have boilerplate pages for this. You can highlight what makes your environment special. Tell them what you want the money for. I'm moving quickly through this because of time. Tell people what people will do and why you need things. Remember that if you're doing clinical research, you will need to include a plan or at least data that suggests you can enroll a diverse group of people and tell people what you expect in terms of women, minorities, and children, if it's applicable for your work. Protection of human subjects, you have to have this stuff represented, including data safety and monitoring if you're doing clinical trial work. All right? You must clearly describe this. Your grant will be dinged big time if you have human subjects work and you don't describe how you're going to protect those people, including ongoing training and protection of human subjects. So not just for trainees, but also for established investigators. So what if your grant gets scored but not funded? You are permitted one resubmission with the same title. Now, a couple years ago, they changed the rules such that you can submit another grant with a different title that is very, very similar to the previous two. So in essentially, the number of revisions is now infinite. You have to retitle it. But again, if something is getting triaged or not funded time and time and time again, there's probably a problem with it. You need to tear it down. But if you are resubmitting, you're permitted 1 page of introduction in which you give a summary of the critiques, a point-by-point response to the critiques, and then a summary of what's new about the application in that single page. Again, here's what the summary of the critiques was. Here are the changes we have made in response to those critiques. Clear, no ambiguity. There are lots of ways to learn how to do this. I mentioned courses and so forth. This is not a commercial because I have no relationship with the publisher or these authors, but this Grant Application Writer's Workbook is what we use in our fellowships, a grant writing course that we do for our critical care fellows. I strongly recommend it. It's readable. It's great. I think it's my favorite. Okay. So read those directions. Work with your mentor on those aims, write succinctly but compellingly, and pay attention to all of those parts, understanding that a grant that doesn't get submitted has a 0% chance of being funded. Don't be scared. Get out there and do it. So sorry for running a few minutes over. I'd be happy to take a couple quick questions.